available suddenly becomes unavailable. Not dramatically, not with an announcement or a confrontation or a carefully worded message explaining that things are going to be different now. Just quietly, gradually, the responses that used to come quickly start coming slower and then not at all. The energy that used to fill every room they shared with certain people starts staying closer to home. The emotional availability that certain people had come to treat as an unlimited resource starts running dry. And the people who had been drawing from that resource without much thought, without much reciprocity, without much consideration for what it actually cost the person providing it, suddenly notice the well is empty, and they do not know what to do with that. They cannot explain the discomfort they feel. They cannot name why the silence from someone they were previously comfortable ignoring or taking for granted is now sitting on their chest like a weight they did not ask to carry. They just know something is different, something shifted, and whatever shifted, it broke something in them they cannot put back together the way it was before. I want to talk about what actually happened when you went quiet, because I do not think you fully understand the magnitude of what your silence accomplished, and I do not think you understand it because the going quiet did not feel like a power move when you made it. It did not feel like strategy. It did not feel like a decision made from a position of strength or clarity or spiritual authority. It felt like exhaustion. It felt like running completely out of the emotional fuel required to keep showing up for dynamics that were draining you without replenishing anything. It felt like a person who has been talking into a room where no one is really listening finally just stopping talking. Not because they found something more powerful to do, simply because continuing felt pointless and the silence felt, for the first time in a long time, like rest. But here is what that exhausted, unplanned, unstrategic silence actually communicated to the people around you who had grown accustomed to your presence and your availability and your consistent emotional output. It communicated that you were no longer organizing your inner world around them. It communicated that the version of you that was always reachable, always responsive, always willing to pour out regardless of whether anything was being poured back, that version had retired. It communicated something that no amount of direct conversation or confrontation or carefully articulated boundary setting could have communicated as effectively, which is that you had found something more important than their opinion of you. And that communication, received without words, landed somewhere in them that words never could have reached. The people who felt it most are the ones who had the most to lose from your self-reclamation. And I want you to understand something about those people, because understanding it is going to release you from a residual guilt that some of you are still carrying about what your silence did to certain relationships. The people who were most disturbed by your going quiet are the people who had the most invested in you staying loud. Loud in the sense of available. Loud in the sense of responsive. Loud in the sense of organizing your energy around their needs and their moods and their presence or absence in your life. They needed you reachable because your reachability was a form of confirmation for them. It confirmed that they mattered. It confirmed that they had influence over your emotional state. It confirmed that they occupied an important enough place in your world that their behavior toward you would consistently produce a reaction from you. And when the reactions stopped coming, when the confirmations stopped arriving, something in their internal architecture that had been quietly depending on your consistency without ever acknowledging that dependence wobbled, and in some cases collapsed entirely. This is not something they could explain to anyone around them, because explaining it would require them to admit things about the dynamic that they were not prepared to admit. It would require acknowledging that they had been drawing from you without depositing anything of equivalent value in return. It would require acknowledging that the relationship, or whatever version of connection existed between you, was built more on your willingness to give than on any genuine mutuality. And people who have been operating in that kind of one-directional dynamic rarely have the self-awareness or the humility to articulate it clearly, even to themselves. So instead they sit with this unnameable discomfort, this irritation that does not have a clean target, this low-grade restlessness that shows up whenever your name crosses their mind or whenever they realize that the version of you they had access to is no longer available in the way it used to be. They cannot explain it, but they feel it every day. And that feeling is the consequence of something they created, but never expected to be held accountable for by your simple, quiet, exhausted decision to stop. I want to take you to Scripture because there is a figure in the Bible whose silence changed everything around them in ways that the people in their world were completely unprepared for. I want to talk about Isaac, not the dramatic moments of Isaac's story, but the quiet ones, because Isaac is one of the most understated figures in Genesis, and yet his life contains something that speaks directly to what you have been experiencing. Isaac was a man who, by the standards of his surrounding culture and the aggressive, expansive personalities that surrounded him on every side, should have been a pushover. His father Abraham was a towering figure. His son Jacob was a schemer and a fighter. The people around Isaac in the land of Canaan were constantly testing him, provoking him, taking from him, and then coming back to take more. The Philistines stopped up the wells that Abraham's servants had dug. Wells in that culture and that climate were not just convenient. They were survival, they were territory, they were legacy. Stopping up a well was an act of aggression and a statement of dominance. And Isaac's response to it was not what anyone expected. He did not fight. He did not escalate. He did not gather his men and make a military response to what was a genuine provocation. He moved. He dug new wells. They were stopped up again. He moved again and dug again. And eventually he arrived at a place where no one contested what he was building, and he named it Rehoboth, which means room, saying, "Now the Lord has given us room, and we will flourish in the land." And then the remarkable thing happened. The very people who had been provoking him and stopping up his wells and pushing him around came to him. Abimelech, the king of the Philistines, came to Isaac with his advisor and his military commander, and he said, "We saw clearly that the Lord was with you. We want to make a treaty with you." The man who had quietly moved and quietly dug and quietly refused to match the aggression directed at him ended up in a position of such evident divine favor that the people who had been the source of the aggression came to him seeking alliance. His quietness was not weakness. It was the most powerful thing available to him in that season, and it produced an outcome that fighting could never have produced. Your quietness is producing an outcome right now that fighting could never have produced. The people who expected you to react, who were in some cases counting on your reaction to give them the upper hand in the dynamic, are sitting with the evidence of a quietness they cannot manage. And that unmanageable evidence is doing work in their hearts and their minds and their understanding of who you actually are. That no confrontation, no matter how well articulated or how righteous, could have done. But there is something else I want to name here because I think it is important, and because some of you need to hear it said plainly. Your going quiet was also an act of self-preservation that was more spiritually significant than it probably felt in the moment. Because when you are constantly pouring into dynamics that are not reciprocal, when you are consistently making yourself available to people who treat your availability as a given rather than as a gift, you are not just losing energy. You are losing something more specific and more costly than energy. You are losing the portions of yourself that were meant for something else. The attention that was going toward managing how certain people perceived you was attention that was meant for your calling. The emotional bandwidth that was being consumed by relationships that were taking more than they were giving was bandwidth that was meant for the work God placed in your hands. The creative and spiritual and relational energy that was draining out through connections that had no capacity to honor it was energy that was supposed to be fueling something significant. When you went quiet, you reclaimed that energy, and the reclamation was not just personal, it was spiritual. It was the beginning of a reallocation of your most valuable inner resources toward the things and the people and the purposes that actually deserved them. And that reallocation, that quiet turning of your attention from the things that were taking from you toward the things that were actually yours to tend, is what God was waiting for. Because He had things to show you and places to take you and work to release through you that required your attention to be pointing in the right direction. And your attention could not point in the right direction while it was being consumed by the management of dynamics that were never going to give you back what you were putting in. I want to talk about what happened in you during the quiet, because I think this is the part of the story that tends to get overlooked in favor of the external effects of your silence on the people around you. Yes, your going quiet broke something in them they cannot explain. That is real and it matters and it is worth understanding. But what your going quiet built in you is far more significant than what it broke in them. Because the silence was not just an absence of output. It was an environment. And in that environment, things that had been drowned out by the noise of constant engagement started to become audible again. You started hearing yourself think, genuinely think, not the anxious, reactive thinking of someone who is always in the middle of managing a dynamic or crafting a response or anticipating how their words are going to land with a particular person. The slower, deeper, more honest thinking of someone who has given themselves enough space to actually process what has been happening in their life and what they actually feel about it and what they actually want and what they actually believe God has said about their future. That quality of thinking is only available in quiet, and you had been so rarely quiet for so long that when the quiet finally came, it probably felt slightly disorienting at first. Like a room that has been loud for so long that when the noise finally stops, the silence itself seems to have a texture and a weight that takes some adjusting to. But as you adjusted, things clarified. Things that had been blurry in the constant noise of engagement became sharp. You started seeing certain relationships and certain dynamics and certain patterns in your own life with a clarity that the constant motion had been preventing. You started understanding why certain things felt the way they felt. You started identifying what you actually valued versus what you had been tolerating in the name of keeping a peace that was never really peace. You started getting honest with yourself in ways that the performance of constant availability had been making very difficult. And in that honesty, in that newly clarified space, God started speaking. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with the particular precision that is only possible when the listener is actually still enough to receive it. He spoke about who you are, not the version that certain people needed you to be to remain comfortable in their relationship with you. The actual version, the one with the specific gifts and the specific calling and the specific assignment that has been written over your life since before you were born. He spoke about where you are going, not the scaled down, compromised, adjusted version of your future that you had been quietly accepting in the midst of dynamics that were too draining to allow for much dreaming. The actual future, the one that requires the full version of you, the one that the quiet was reconstructing, the one that the reallocation of your energy was making possible again. He spoke about what he needed from you next. And because you were finally quiet enough to hear it, you received it in a way that you had not been able to receive anything for a very long time. That is the real fruit of your going quiet, not the discomfort it caused in the people who had been taking you for granted. That is a byproduct. The real fruit is what was produced in you in the silence, the clarity, the reclaimed energy, the reconstructed sense of self, the renewed capacity to hear from God, the honest inventory of your life that only the quiet made possible, the return to yourself that was the prerequisite for every good thing that is coming in your next season. I want to close by saying something to the people who are sitting in the quiet right now and are not entirely sure they made the right choice, who went quiet not from a place of spiritual clarity, but from a place of exhaustion and hurt and the desperate need to stop bleeding, and who are now sitting in the silence wondering if the quiet was actually wisdom, or if it was avoidance dressed up as self-preservation. I want to say to those people directly that the motive does not disqualify the outcome. You do not have to have gone quiet for perfectly spiritual reasons for the quiet to produce something significant. God is not limited to working through our best and most spiritually mature decisions. He works through our exhaustion. He works through our breaking points. He works through the moments where we stop, not because we have figured out the strategic thing to do, but because we literally have nothing left to give, and the stopping is the only option remaining. He was in the exhaustion that brought you to the quiet. He was in the hurt that made the noise unbearable. He was in the breaking point that turned out to be a turning point. And he is in the silence now, building something in you that the noise was preventing. Something that is going to make the next chapter of your life look so different from the chapters that came before it, that the people who knew you in the loud seasons are going to struggle to reconcile the person they are seeing now with the person they thought they understood then. That reconciliation is their work to do. Your work is to stay in the quiet long enough to receive everything that God is trying to give you in it, to let the silence finish its work, to let the clarity fully arrive, to let the reclaimed energy find its rightful direction, to let the reconstructed you become fully solid before you start making yourself available again to a world that will have no shortage of demands on what you carry. You went quiet, and yes, it broke something in them they cannot explain, but more importantly, it built something in you that nothing else could have built. And what was built in you in the quiet is the thing that your actual life, your called life, your purposed and anointed and divinely designed life has been waiting for all along. Stay in the quiet a little longer. What God is finishing in there is worth the wait. Drop the word quiet in the comments if this found you right where you needed it today. Share this with someone who needed permission to stop explaining their silence and start trusting what it is producing. Subscribe, because this community is built for chosen ones who are learning that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply become still.